You ready to take your Android development skills to the next level? Then you're in the right place. In this tutorial series, we are going to show you step by step how to build a powerful and efficient shopping list app using the latest tools and techniques in Android development. We'll be using Jetpack Compose and Room database to create a beautiful UI, store and retrieve data, and connect it all together. This is not your average tutorial. We're going to dive deep into the code and give you an in-depth understanding of how everything works. So whether you're a beginner or an experienced developer, this tutorial is for you. So fasten your seatbelt and let's get started. To start to write our code, we should have a common starting point. And for this case, you have to import the GitHub project from the link provided in the description box below. So you can navigate here inside the file and click new, and then you can easily navigate here to project from version control system. And when you click here, you will pass in the URL which is provided in the link in the description box. And for this case here, you can just easily click clone here and the application is going to be cloned. Then we can easily get started. So now we want to start to write our code. So the first thing here, we want to create a new package. So you can navigate here to Kotlin new and select here package. And we want to create a new package that is called data. So this one is going to help us to organize our codes and files in a place where we're going to get our data. So we can create another package, and we want to create this package to be a local database, or we can just call this room so that we can easily understand that we have a package where we have our data rising from room databases. Okay, so the next thing here, we want to create our models. So we can just easily select here new and create a new package and call this model. And basically, let's create here a new Kotlin class or file, and we want to call this model. Okay, so now we want to create our tables where we're going to store our data. So the first case here, we want to create a data class that is going to represent the shopping list. So for example, here we can easily call this data class, and basically we don't want to call this models. So we want to call this, for example, shopping list. And basically here we want to provide the variables or properties which we want them. So for example, here we want to be this ID, and we can just provide this to be an int. So the first case, we have to annotate this class with @entity so that we can tell room, hey, this is just going to be a table inside our database. So just create the implementation for it. So we can just annotate this with @entity. And for example, here we can provide the table name. So let's call this table name. And basically we can just rename to whatever we want. So for our case, we're just going to call this shopping list. Okay, so we want also to make this to be primary key. So a primary key is just something that is going to identify every item inside our table. So we have rows and columns. So every row has a unique ID that is going to represent this record inside this table so that we can easily access it. And we have to tell room database to store this to be as a primary key. And for our case, our ID is going to be our primary key. So we're going to have a lot of data classes. So we want to rename this ID to match our shopping list, for example. So we can use @column_info to tell room database to rename this variable when it's going to store it inside our database. So we can just call this column_info. And basically we want to rename this, so we can provide here the name. Then, for example, we can just call this list ID. And basically it's going to store this as an ID. Okay, so another thing which we want to store here is a name. So we can just call this name of that particular item. Let's add here a comma first. This is just going to be of type string. Okay, so before we start to write the other model classes, we have first to understand the relational database design, because SQLite is just a relational database design, and we are going to use this inside our application. So let's jump here and see what is a relational database design. Now let's speak about relational database. So a relational database design is the method of organizing data in a database using tables and relationships between them. So the main idea behind relational database is that the data is stored in separate tables, and those tables are linked together using relationships, which allows the data to be accessed and manipulated in a structured and efficient way. So we can have data in different tables, but we can easily join them and use them when we want to organize our data. So in a relational database, data is organized into tables, also known as relations. So each table has a set of columns and rows, and each row represents a single record in the table. So for example, here we have the ID, which is denoted as the primary key. So the primary key is just a unique identifier of each record which we insert. So every row is just like a new record inside our database, and this ID is going to represent that this is just going to be a unique identifier of that particular record. So there are three main types of relationships that can be established between tables: one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many. Now let's look at each particular one. So we have a one-to-one relation. So a one-to-one relationship is where one record in one table corresponds to one and only one record in another table. So for example, here we have two tables. So we have a customer and the address, and we want that only a single customer can have the same address, not two customers having the same addresses. So how can we do this? Basically, we have to introduce a new item inside our customer table, which is just the address ID, which is going to be stored inside here, and this is just a foreign key. So a foreign key is just a column or a set of columns that are going to uniquely identify an item in another table. So for example, this is going to directly point to the primary key of this address here, and basically we are going to store it inside our customer table so that when we want to get this data, we can easily just fetch the primary key, and then we can join these tables and use them. So this is just called one-to-one relation. And also we have a one-to-many. So a one-to-many is a relationship where one record in one table corresponds to many records in another table. So for example, here we have the items and the shopping list. So here, for example, the shopping list table is going to have a single item that corresponds to many items that are going to be there. So for example, we have a shopping list category of, for example, fruits. So here we can have bananas, we can have, for example, mangoes and other things that correspond to the same category, but there are just many. So here we have one category and here we have many items. So this is just one to many. And basically, for this case, we have also to store the shopping list ID, which is just the foreign key, and we can easily just map this. So whenever we find this ID here, then we can just join these two tables and have the data inside our application. And also we have the last one, which is just many to many. So a many to many relationship is where many records in one table correspond to many records in another table. So this type of relationship is usually resolved by creating a joint table with the foreign keys of both tables. So when you look closely here, you can see we have a shopping list and also a customer and another table that is just called the customer shopping list join. And basically here we have two primary keys from each table. And basically here we have a one to many and here a one to many. So basically this is just going to point to one here and one to here. So whenever we want to create this many to many, it's just, for example, we have a lot of customers having different types of shopping list. And basically here we can easily join these two tables. Okay, now let's finish to create other tables. So the second table which we want to create here is the items. So we can just easily create here at entity. And we can just call this to be table name. And rename this to be items. Now let's create here our data class. And we can just call this item. And now here we want to create our ID, so we can just easily create here column info and rename the name here to use as the item ID. And we want to make this to be a primary key for this item. And basically now we want to create our ID. Just call here ID to be of type int. And we want to make this primary key to be auto-generating whenever we insert a new record. So how can we do this? Basically, we can just tell room, hey, auto-generate this particular item. And basically here we can just make this to be 0 so that whenever we create the item class, we do not have to pass this ID here. So we have to provide this default implementation. Also, we can create other variables. So for example, item name. This is just going to be of type string. Also, we want to get the quantity. Okay, so now we want to join between these two tables, and earlier we said that we can easily do this by providing the primary key inside, for example, this table here. We want to join between this item table and the shopping list table. So how can we do this? Basically, we can use the primary key of this item inside here. So let's save here our list ID. So we can create a variable and call this list ID. And basically, this is just going to be the foreign key, and this is going to be of type int. Also, we want to create the link between the items and the stores which we are going to purchase them. So for this case, we can create another foreign key. So for example, this is just going to be the store ID foreign key. So this is just the foreign key of the table which we have not created, and we are going to create in just a moment. So this is just going to be of type int. And also we want to save the date. And also we want to store if this is going to be checked or not. So we can just call this is checked. And basically this is just going to be of type Boolean. So now let's create the store table. Now let's create a new data class here. And we can just call this store table. Okay, we have to annotate this with @entity. We can just rename this to stores. Okay, now let's provide here the variables. So we want to provide the ID, and also we want this to be auto-generated. So we can just provide here, for example, at column info. And also we can just provide this to be the primary key, and we want to set the auto-generate to true. Okay, also we want to join between the store and the list table. So we can easily introduce here the list ID foreign key. This is just going to be of type int. So whenever we store this table here, we're going also to store the reference of this primary key here. So whenever we want to get the shopping list and the stores, we can easily just use the join between these two variables. Now we have finished to create our data classes and entities. So now let's create our data access objects, which are just methods which are going to help us to interact with our database. So we can perform the CRUD operations by using DAOs. So now let's jump inside here, our room package, and now let's create a new hosting class of file. And basically we want to create a file and call this DAO. Now let's first create the items DAO. So this is just an interface, and we can just call this item DAO. And basically we have to annotate this with @DAO to tell room, hey, this is just going to be a DAO implementation. So now when we finish to create that, now we can just start to create our methods inside here. Okay, so when we want to perform the CRUD operation like inserting, deleting, and other things, so we have to perform them here. We can create a suspend function, and we want to call this insert. And basically this is going to help us to insert our item. We can just call this item. Okay, so we have to annotate this with @insert to tell room, hey, create the implementation for inserting the data. So when we call this @insert, and we want to provide the on-conflict strategy. So for example, when we insert an item that has the same ID, then we have to, for example, replace or ignore. So for our case here, we want to replace whenever we provide this. So we can just use the on-conflict strategy and call .replace. So for our case here, whenever the items have the same ID, they are going to be replaced with a new one. Okay, so we have to create another one, which is just @update. And here we can just pass in the on-conflict strategy as the same. And create a suspend function, and we want to call this update. And easily we can just pass in the items, and then it's going to update the items. Okay, now we have to add another annotation, which is just @delete. And basically we have to provide a suspend function here and call this delete. And basically we can just pass in here the items, and the items is going to be deleted. So as you can see here, we are using suspend functions throughout these methods, because these methods are going to take sometimes a lot of times. So we don't want to clog the main UI thread. So for this case, we have to use another thread in order to execute these methods. That's why we are using here, for example, suspend functions whenever we want to delete these. Okay, so the next way here is just to get the items. So we can use @query and provide a query statement whenever we want, for example, to get an item. So basically here we can just call here, for example, @query. And inside here now we want to provide the query which we want to get. So for example, here we want to select, and we're going to pass in here the asterisks, meaning we want to select everything from the item table. We can just call from items. And basically it's going to get everything from the item tables. Now let's pass in here a function, and we want to call this get all items. And this one is going to return a flow. So we are going to use here a flow, so you can use live data and other things. So for a case here, we want to use a flow, and this is just going to be a list of items. So we want to get every record inside our items. So as you can see here, we are not using a suspend function because we are using here a flow, and flow is just a called item. So basically here, whenever we want to use this, we have to use a coroutine scope in order to consume this data. And that's why we are not using here a suspend function. Okay, now let's add another item here to get a specific item. So let's add @query. And here basically now we have to provide the query. So for example, here we want to select everything from the items. And basically now we want to filter here. So we want to filter with where. So we want to use this item ID is going to be equal to the ID which is going to be provided. So now let's create here the item ID. Okay, now let's create here our function, and we want to get the item. And basically here we have to pass in the item ID whenever we want to access this. This is just going to be of type int. And this is just going to return a flow, and it's just going to return a single item. So as you can see here, we are just filtering our database by matching the IDs, which is going to be provided here. So for example, whenever we click a single item here and we want to open it, we have to pass in the ID and tell Rook database to filter this data when they match the IDs. So this is just one way of creating our DAO. Now let's create another DAO for another item. Okay, now let's create another interface, and we're just going to call this Store DAO. And this is just going to be similar to the DAO which we have written there for the items. So let's just call this @DAO. And basically we want to provide the methods which are just similar to this one. So we can just easily copy this and paste it inside here. So instead of items here, we want to insert a store. And here, instead of updating an item, so we have to pass in a store. And here, for example, on getting all items, we can just easily change this to get all stores. And here we want to select the stores table. And this is just going to return here store. Okay, and here we want to get, for example, a specific store. We can just easily call this get store. Basically, here we can pass in the store ID. And here we want to select from the store table. And we want to change these variables here to be the store ID is going to be equal to the store ID, which is provided here. So as you can see, when you want to access this, you have to pass in these two columns here. And for case, the return type here is going to be store. Okay, so these two DAOs are just similar. So we're going to write here a shopping list DAO, which is just much more complicated. So now let's write it. Okay, now let's create here our new interface, and we can just call this list DAO. This is just going to be the DAO for our shopping list. And we can just easily annotate this with @DAO. Okay, now we can just easily create our methods. So for example, here the suspend function, and we want to insert the shopping list. So basically here we're going to pass in the shopping list as normal. And here we want to annotate this with @insert. And provide here the on-conflict strategy, and we want to replace this. So we can just call this on-conflict strategy and .replace, and basically it's going to replace. So this is just similar to those which we have written. Okay, now let's create here our function to get the items with the stores and list. So we're going to join between multiple tables. So we can just create here a new function, and we call this get items. And basically this is just going to return us our stores. Okay, so we have to write here @query and provide our query. So because this query is going to be long, so I'm going to using this string template here so that we do not have problems when we are writing and for visibility purposes. Okay, now we want to call here our select as normal. So we want to select everything from the items table. Okay, so we are going to use here as keyword so that we can rename the table name so that we can easily reference this when we are writing inside our query. We can use these items as I, and we want to provide the inner join keyword. And this is going to tell, hey, we want to join between the items and this particular table. So we want to again join between the items and the shopping list table. And we can just rename this as S. And now we want to provide the condition to join between these two tables. So we can just provide on. So the on keyword here is going to tell, hey, we want to provide the condition to join between these two tables. And as you know, inside the items table, we saved the items and the shopping list ID. So we can use here, for example, the list ID. And this list ID must be matching with the ID inside our shopping list. So we can just use s.list ID. So basically here now we are going to compare between these two. If they are equal, then we can just return that item. And also we want to provide another inner join. And we want to join this together with another table. So we can provide here inner joins, and we want to join the store table. And we can just rename this as ST so that we can easily reference this inside our code. And now we can use this. We can provide the on keyword so that we want to filter this again. So we can just use I.store ID. And this is just the foreign key of the ID which we have. And then we want to match this with the store's ID. So we can just use st.store ID. So as you have seen here, now we have performed our query. So we want to select everything from the items table. And we use this as to rename these items name so that we can easily reference this inside our code. And we use this inner join to tell that we want to combine between the items and the shopping list table. And as you can see here, we use this on keyword in order to provide a condition to join between these two tables. And for our case here, we are using the list ID foreign key and also the list ID, which is just going to be arising from the shopping list table. And basically when these are going to be true, then these items are going to be joined. And also we perform another inner join again to join the store table. And for this case, we provide the condition that the foreign key that is stored inside the items table must match with the store ID. And for this case, we are going to return our item. So now here we have written our query. Now we want to return all of these items. So as you can see here, we are joining between three tables. And then this is going to return three entities: the items, the shopping list, and also the stores. So we don't have a single data class that is going to manage to hold all of this data. So we have to create a separate data class that is going to hold this data, and we can easily use it inside our UI when we want to display our data. So for this case, we can just jump below here and call our data class, and we want to call this items. And now we want to insert these two items. So for example, here we want to call this item. And also here we want to pass in the shopping list. And also we want to pass in the store. Okay, so all of these items are just embedded, and we have to tell the room that these items are going to be embedded. And the embedded item is just when we provide, or we use a join query because we're joining between 3 entities. And for this case, we can use just an annotation here and call this at embedded. Okay, so as you can see here, we are just returning all of these items in one go. So for this case, we can just provide here our flow, a list with items and store. So whenever we use this type of join query, then we can just use these items with this store list and retrieve it and use it inside our UI. Now let's provide another method that is going to help us to filter this, for example, according to the list. So for example, when we provide here an ID and we want to filter them according to certain categories, for example, the shopping list, so you can just easily press Ctrl+C and copy this and paste in here Ctrl+V and paste it here. And now we want to call this filtered. So we want to filter this by list ID, and here basically we can just easily add another condition here, which is just by using a where clause. So for example here where, and then we want to check between the store and if this is just going to be equal to the list ID which we have, and here basically we have to provide the ID which we want to filter with. So we can just pass in here the list ID. So basically here we're going to pass in the list ID so that we can easily filter our data according to this list ID. So we can just pass in here the list ID. So we have added here a where clause which is going to filter this according to the stores according to the list ID. And also we can just add another method which is just going to get us a single item with just the which is filtered according to the item's ID. So now we can just copy here, Ctrl+C and paste it here. Now we want to call this, we want to get the item, and now it's not the items. We're going to return a single item with a store and list filtered by the ID. And now we want to pass in here the item ID. And basically instead of using here the street, we can just use the item and pass in here the item ID, which is filtered with the item ID which we have passed here. So you're going to see this when we use inside our UI. So here we are just filtering, we want to get a single item. So instead of a list, we can just change this here. And we want to return the items with store and list. So here we want an item filtered by the item ID. And here we want to filter this according to the list ID. And for example, here we have used this store. So here we have to use the S, which is just for shopping list here, and not the ST, which is just for store. We can just use this S.list ID, and instead of filtering this with using the store. So we want to filter this according to this store ID, which is just the ID which we are going to be providing here. Now we have finished to create here our methods and the DAOs. We can easily now create our database class, which is going to help us to connect between the database and provide us with the access to the DAOs. So now let's create here a new class, and we can easily call this shopping list database. Okay, so this must be an abstract class and must inherit from the room database. So we can just easily call this room database. And we have to annotate this with @database. And now inside here, we have to provide the entities. So this is going to provide us with the connection to the database. So we provide here the entities which we have. And this is just an array. And here, for example, we have our first, which is just shopping list. So we provide all of the entities which we have created. And the last one, which is just the store. Okay, so the first case we have finished. Now we have to provide the version. So this version here is really important. For example, when we want to migrate our database to another version, then we can easily bump up this number. So for our case here, it's just the first version. And then here we have the export schema. And for our case here, we are just going to pass in this to be false. So we are going to see these when we write the migrations. So for now, we are just going to leave this as false here. Okay, so now we want to provide the access to the DAOs because this method is going to manage the connection and creating the database. So we have to get the method so that we can easily access our database. So for our case here, we can create an abstract function, which is just, for example, the List DAO. So we want to be able to access our List DAO. Now let's first create here a little room. And this is just going to be of type List DAO. And it's going to return our Store DAO. Okay, so we have said that this database class is responsible in creating the connection to the database. So we have to be able to create the database from this class. So how can we do this? And creating a database is just, we have to manage the threads, and also we have to get a single instance throughout our application. So, and an abstract class, we cannot instantiate this class here because this is just an abstract class. So for this case, we can easily create a companion object, because this companion object here is going to help us to create the instance of this class without instantiating this class. So for this case here, for example, we want now to create our instance. And the first case here, because this is going to be accessed in different threads, we have to manage the threads. And basically we can use @volatile. And this volatile here is going to tell, hey, you have to manage this in a thread safe manner. And we're going to do this. Now let's create here an instance, var, and call this instance. And basically this instance is going to return a shopping list database. And basically this is going to be nullable for the first time, because this, whenever we instantiate for the first time, we want to make this to be null so that we can easily instantiate. Now let's create a method that is going to get the database. So let's create here a fun, and we want to call this get database, and provide here a context which is going to be used to instantiate the database. And this is going to be of type context. And now this is going to return the shopping list database. Okay, so we're going to return the instance. But this instance is going to be nullable for the first time. So we have to use this Elvis operator here. So if this is going to be null, then we have to create a new database. And for this case, we can just use a synchronized. And this basically is going to lock. Only a single thread is going to be able to do this. So for example, if we have multiple threads that are running in parallel and call this get database, then whenever we provide this lock here, it's going to lock this, and only one instance is going to be able to access this. And for that case, now let's create our new instance. So we can just call this instance with the small letters. And now we can use our room in order to create our database. And now we can call database builder. And now provide the class name, which is just the shopping list database. And here basically we can just provide the name. So for example, here we can just call this shopping database. And basically here we can just call .build, and this is just going to be building this. And now we want to instantiate this instance here to a new variable because we have already created an instance here. So we can just call this instance equals to this instance. And basically here we have created our instance, and we can just call return instance. Okay, so the second time we call this get database here because this instance is no longer going to be null, then this instance which we have created here for the first time is going to be returned. So we will not call this code because this is not going to be nullable. So this is how we create the database in a thread safe manner, and we have only a single instance throughout our application until when it's going to be killed and create a new database when we relaunch our application. Okay, so now we have finished to create here our database. We can just easily call this build here or make project so that we can see if we have any errors and fix them. Now let's just press this. and make the room database to generate those implementation of everything which we have written here. And the error is just field has a non-unique column name. As you can see here, we have a column name that is called list ID FK throughout our DAOs. So let's just come here inside our models. As you can see here, we have this list ID foreign key, and also this is just called the list ID foreign key. So we can just easily change this list ID foreign key. So we can just create here Shift F6 so that we can just change this, and we can just call this list ID so that we can just differentiate them. Now we can just easily refactor this, and it's going to refactor everything. So here, instead of list ID foreign key, we're just going to pass in as a list ID. Okay, now let's rebuild again and see if we have any problem. Okay, so this is just the great thing about Room database, because it provides compile time verification. So as you can see here now, Room is complaining again that it cannot figure out how to save this field into database. So you can see here it's providing us with the suggestion you can consider adding a type converter for it. Okay, so now let's navigate here to our Room package and create a new package. So you can just easily navigate here and create this package and call this, for example, converters. And inside here now we can just insert all of the converters which we want. So for our case, let's create here a new coding class or file, and we want to create here a file, and we are going to call it, for example, date converter. Now let's create here an open class, and we can just call this date converter. And inside here we are going to have two methods. So the first case here, let's create a function, and we want to call this, for example, toDate. And right now here we are going to receive, we can just import this first. And we want to use this java.util. And we have to write here a return function. And for example, here we have to receive a long, because we're going to be converting this. And for this case here, now we can just use here. So for example, let's just call this date. Okay, now we want to transform this to a date. And basically here what we are doing, we are going to transform this, because this is going to be in a form of long. So we want to transform this back to a date. That's why we are just using here a date class, and then we're just converting it. And basically here we have to assign this with a type converter. And basically we are going to tell Room, hey, this method is going to be used to convert a date from long to a date format, which can be easily understood by Android OS. And we can easily create another type converter. We can just call this type converter and create a function and call this, for example, from date, so that we can easily differentiate this method. And basically here now we are going to, we have a date, and basically we want to return here a long. So we can make this to be, for example, nullable, so that we can easily deal with this. And basically here we want to return now a date that is going to be converted to a long. So we can just call this date.time, and this basically is going to return us a time. Okay, so now let's try to run here our application and see the output. Okay, so when you run your application, you can see we are going to get this error again, cannot figure out how to save this field into database. So for this case, we have already created here our date converter, and this is going to tell Room to create a method that is going to help us to convert between this when we are saving it to SQLite. But right now here, Room does not know for this class. So what we have to do, we have to navigate here inside our shopping list. So we can just come here inside our shopping list database, and above here our database, we can create another annotation. So we can annotate this with our type converters. So we have to use now type converters, because we're going to pass in here several converters if you have. And then basically here we can just create the values. And this is just an array. So for this case, we can easily create here our arrays which we have. So if you have several classes for converters, so for our case here, we have created just date converter, and we can pass in this to be a class. And basically right now here, Room understand that we have a date converter. So right now when we try to build our application, it's going to successfully run. Now let's try again. So now you can see our app has successfully launched, and for this case we have not got those dreadful errors that we cannot figure out how to save custom data type. So in this video here we are going to create our repository that is going to help us to connect between the data layer and the UI layer. So for this case we can easily access our database. So right now we can navigate here inside our UI package and create a new package. So we can just create here a new package and call it this going to be a repository. And inside here now, let's create a new Kotlin class of file, and we can just call this repository. Okay, so here we have our class, which is going to be a repository, and inside here we want to access all of the DAOs. So we can just create here a private val and call this, for example, List DAO. Okay, so now we have access to all of our DAOs. Now we can easily create methods and properties which we can easily access them. So for example, here we want to get all of the stores. So we can just create here a variable and call this, for example, store. And we can easily call our Store DAO. And we call get all stores. And basically here we have now all of our store. Now we can get, for example, the items with the list and store. So for example, you can just call this get items. Okay, now we want to create the function which is going to get us the items with a store and list filtered by the ID. Okay, now let's create here a function, and we can just call this function, for example, to get items with a store and list. With the store and list, and basically here we want to pass in the ID so that we can easily filter these items. So this is going to be of type int, and here we are going to call the List DAO. And basically we want to get the items with ID filtered by the item ID. So let's keep this in the next line for readability. And basically here now we want to pass in the ID, which is going to help us to filter this. Okay, now let's create here another function. And now we want to get the item with a store filtered by the ID. So whenever we want to filter our database, so for example, when we select a certain category, we can easily use this method. So we can just call here get item. And this is going to be filtered by the ID. And basically here now we want to pass in the ID, which is going to be of type int. And we want to call here the get items filtered by ID. And here basically we can easily pass in the ID. Okay, now here we have our methods which are going to give us our data. Now let's create here the suspend functions, which is going to help us to insert. So let's create here a suspend function and call this insert list. And now we want to pass in here the shopping list. And basically we can just call here our List DAO. And we want to insert our shopping list, and basically we can just pass in here our shopping list. Okay, now let's insert here, for example, the store. And we can call here our Store DAO. Now let's create here a suspend function and insert here, for example, our item. And we can pass in here the item. And basically we can call here our item DAO.insert and pass in here our item. Okay, now here we want, for example, to delete an item. So we can easily create here a suspend function and call this delete item. And basically here we want, for example, to pass in the item which we have, and we're going to delete it. So for example, here we can just call here our item DAO and pass in the item which we want to delete, and basically we leave everything to room to handle this. Let's create another suspend function. We want to update the item, so we can just call here update item. Okay, so these are all of the methods which we are going to use them in our case for now. So if you want to update or continue this application, you can just easily play around and add other methods. So for now, here we have all of these methods which we are going to use them. So here we have a method that is going to return us the store. We have the items with list and store. And whenever we want to filter our databases, we are going to use these methods here to help us to filter this database. We want to be able to insert this list DAO here. So we have already created, for example, here our DAOs, but we cannot easily just create this and pass them inside our view model, for example. So we have to create a cleaner way which we can easily manage this dependency. So for example, if you are using another project, you can use the dependency injection library. But for our case, this is just a small tutorial. We can just easily inject them manually, but we can just use this by using a singleton option. So how can we do this? We can easily create here a new quoting class or file. And here basically we can just create an object, select here an object, which is going to help us to create singleton or a single instance of the databases, which we can easily use them inside our application. So for this case here, we can just call this to be a graph. And now we have here our object. Now we can create a letInit variable for the database. So let's create here a letInit variable and call this database. And we can just pass in here our shopping list database. So we want to have only a single instance of this database throughout our application. That's why we are using here an object. And for this case, we want to make this to be a private set. So we cannot set this outside of this class. That's why we are passing here a private set. And now we want to create our repository also. So we can just create here repository. And we can use by lazy. So we don't want to be able to initialize this every time now and then. And now as you can see here, we have our lazy. And now let's create here a repository. And now when we want to pass in here, for example, the List DAO, we can just easily pass in here our database.dao. Okay, so this is how you manage dependency when you don't want to use a dependence library. And for case here, now we want to create a method that is going to provide the database, because here we have not initialized this. We have just created a variable so that we can easily use this inside our repository. And for this case here, now we can just call provide. And we want to pass in here a context, which is going to help us to create our database. So let's pass in here context. And now let's create here our database and call here our shopping database. And we call .getDatabase, and basically we have to pass in here the context. Okay, so this method here is required to be called so that we can pass in the context. And how can we do this? So we have to create a function, or we have to do it inside our main onCreate method. And to do this, we have to create an Android application file. So we can just easily come here and create a new quoting class or file. And we want to select here a class, and we want to call this, for example, Jet Shopping. Okay, so inside here, we can just come inside the onCreate method here. Now we want to use our graph.provide. And here, basically, we have to pass in the context and call this. And basically here now we have provided the context. So whenever our application is going to be created, then we are going to call this method here. And now we have to jump inside here our Android manifest here. And basically inside here, we have to register this new application which we have created. So we can pass in here the Android.name, and it's going to recognize this Jet Shopping application. And for this case, we are going to solve the problem where we have to pass in here the context inside our graph. And basically we can just easily use this repository and the database because they are going to be initialized in a singleton option. So for now here, we have to finish up our UI by creating our UI layer. So in the previous video, we managed to create here our graph and the repository and connect everything together. So in this video, we're going to create our UI layer and basically hook up everything. So for now, let's navigate here inside our UI and create new packages. So for example, here we're going to create a package for home. So we can just call this home, and also a package for detail. So we're going to have basically two screens, and the detail and home. And here we have to rename this because we have to use a small capital letter here instead of Now inside here, our home, we can easily create now our coding class or file. And basically now let's create here our class and call this home view model. And this is going to directly inherit from the view model. And here basically we can pass in the repository. So let's create here a private variable and call this repository. And we can easily initialize this by using our graph. Okay, now let's create here our data class, which is going to help us to store our state. So let's create here a data class. And basically we are just going to call this home state. And this data class here is going to hold up the items. So for example, here we're going to have the items. And this is going to be a list of items. Items with the store and list. And basically we can just initialize this to an empty list. Okay, now let's create here another variable for category. We can just call this category. And basically we want to use this hoods.com.getshopping here. And we can easily initialize this to an empty category. Okay, another thing here, we want to check if the item is going to be checked or not. So we can just call this item checked. And by default, we can just make this to be false here. Okay, now let's create here our state. So we can easily create here a variable and call this, for example, state. And we can use here a mutable state list of. And basically here we want to pass in our home state, which is just going to be an empty home state. And we have to import here some values. And we want to make this private set so that we can not initialize or change the state outside of our view model. We want to create here a function that is going to help us to get the items first before we initialize here our view model. So let's create here our private function. So this one is going to communicate with the view model and get the items. So let's call here our view model scope first. And we want to call here our repository. So this is going to return a flow here, and we want to collect this inside our view model. That's why we have used a view model scope, because we want to use the suspend function here. And the suspect function, which is just the collect. So we can just call here our collect latest. And this one is going to fetch the last items, and then it's going to return to us. And for this case here, now we can just initialize our state and call state.copy. And now we can change here our items and change it back to it. So basically here we are just sending here our get items with the list, and this is going to return a flow. And we call here collect latest, which is just a suspend function, as you can see here. That's why we are using here a view model scope.launch. And then we are going to collect the state and also save it inside here our state variable. And for this case, we can easily update our state. So we want to get this whenever we initialize our variable or whenever we initialize our view model. So we can easily call here our init function and call get items. So whenever this view model is going to be created, we want to get the list of the items and stores which are available inside our database. Okay, so other functions here are, for example, whenever we want to delete an item, so we can just create here a function which is going to help us to delete items. And basically now we can just easily call our view model scope again. And we can just call here our repository. So delete item, and then we can pass in here our item. And basically we can easily delete our items. Okay, so we want also, whenever we are going to have inside our view, we are going to be filtering data according to a category. So we can create here a function that is going to help us to change the state of the categories which is going to be selected. And for this case, we can just create here the on category change. And here we're going to receive a category, which is going to help us to change the state. So we can just change here our state. And this one is going to be equal to the category which we are going to create. So we want also to execute a filtering function. So we can easily create here a filter by ID, for example, a function. Now let's create here another function, private fun. Okay, so now let's write here an if statement. So for example, when we want to filter by ID, then we're going to use a shopping list ID. And when not, again, we can just easily get the items. So we can check here if we want to filter the shopping list ID. So if this shopping list ID is not going to be to a random number, which we're going to assign here. So for example, we have this random number here, which is going to help us. We know that we are inside a filtering function. So let's call here our view model. And we want to call here our repository. And we're going to filter this according to the ID by using this method here. And now we can just pass in here our shopping list. And we can just easily call here our collect latest. And we can change our state. And basically we can change here our items to be equal to the items which is going to be filtered. So otherwise, if we have not passed the shopping list to be equal to this one, then we can easily just get all of the items. So we are filtering without anything. So else here we can just pass in our else function. Now we just call here our get items to return that items without filtering with anything. So here, as you can see, we are going to be filtering according to the ID. Then we change our state here back to these filtered items. Otherwise, whenever we don't want to filter our database according to the ID, so we filter this to none, then we are going to call this get items here instead of just filtering this. That's why we have created here a function which is just going to be the get items here. Okay, so whenever we do this, so when we change here our categories, then we want to call here, for example, filter by, and basically pass in here the ID which we are going to be changing. And now we can just select here our category.id, for example, and basically here we are going just to change our items according to the category ID. So this was the method which is going to be called when we select a chip and change our database and filtering them. So whenever we change, for example, an item is going to be selected. So for example, a tick mark is going to be selected. Then we have to create another function which is going to update the state. So we can just call here on item checked change. And basically here we're going to receive the item and also is checked. So we have to receive a Boolean function here, a Boolean variable. So inside here, the method we want to change our database so that this item is going to be updated. So we can call here our view model scope.launch. Again, this is just a suspend function. So for this case here, now we can just call here our repository. And we want to update the item right now. So we don't want to change the entire item. So we can use an item update function here. We can just call here our item. And then it's going to be item.copy. And now we want to change this item here, and we can check is checked and basically pass in the variable which is going to be passed here. So if it's going to be true or false, then we are going to reflect it inside here. And for this case, we have easily updated our database. So this is going to be all of what we're going to be using inside our home view model. So feel free to examine this or to expand the application to include other things which you want. So for our case here, this is just enough for our application. So we have delete here function, and also here we have updated our item. So our view model here is ready. Now we can easily navigate here inside our home and create a new package. And basically we are just going to call this home, which is just going to be our home screen. Okay, now let's start to create here our home screen. So the first case here, we can just create our composable. And we want to call this home screen. So we want to pass in here a simple parameter which is going to help us to navigate. So we can just call this on navigate. So this is going to be a lambda function which is going to take up an int and return a unit. Okay, so here we want to pass in the ID whenever we navigate here, for example, from the home screen to the details screen. Okay, so the first case here, we want to obtain the home view model. So basically we can just use the view model. So if you don't have this method, you must make sure that you have added the compose view model dependency inside your build.gradle files. Okay, now we want to obtain the home state. We can just call here our home view model, and we want to get the state. Okay, so we are going to surround everything inside the scaffold. So for this case, let's call here our scaffold, and inside here we can just pass in a floating action button. Okay, so let's create here a floating action button, and inside the on click here we want to execute the navigation here. So inside here, let's call here on navigate.invoke. And basically here we have to pass in the ID. So because whenever we click the floating action button, we are going to navigate to the details screen to create a new item. So for this case, we want to pass in a default value, which is going to help us to understand whenever we are inside the details screen that, hey, we want to create a new item and not update an existing item. So for this case, we are going to pass in -1. Okay, and inside here now we can just pass in the icon. We can use the image vectors, so we can use icons. And here we want to call the add, which is going to add the items. And basically here we can just pass in null. Okay, so now we want to display the items inside a lazy column. So for this case, we can easily navigate inside here our scaffold object and create a lazy column. And inside here now we can just easily pass in our contact. Okay, so the first case here we want to have the display chips. So for this case here we can just create the item and basically create here our lazy row, which is going to display the items inside the row here. Okay, now let's create a composable that is going to help us to display these chips. Okay, so as you can see here, we have the items, which is going to help us to create these chips here. So for this case here, we can navigate here below and create a new function. And we can easily call this category item. Okay, so inside here, the category items, we want to pass in several variables. So the first case here, we want to pass in the drawable res. And for a case here, we're just going to call this icon. Now let's navigate here below and create a new composable. So we can write here comp. And inside here, we're going to pass in several variables. So the first case here, we want to get the icons. So we're going to create here the drawable res. And we can just call this icon res. And it's going to be of type int. And also here we want to create a title. And we want to be able to pass in here the callback whenever we click our item. Okay, so right now here we have the on item click. Okay, so inside here we can easily create a card and pass in here a modifier. Okay, so the first case here we want to pass in the padding, and we are going to pass in here the top to be 8dp. Okay, so we want to be able to select this card, so we can just pass in here the selectable modifier, and then we want to see if this is going to be selected or not. And if it's going to be selected, then we are going to pass in here our selected state, and then we want to pass in here the interaction source. So we are going to use the mutable interaction source. And also we want to show the indication that the user there is something is happening. So we can just use here remember repo, which is going to help us to remember this. And the on click here, basically we can just pass in here the on click, and we want to invoke the on item clicked whenever we just pass in here. So we can just invoke it here. Okay, so this is just the first case here. Okay, so another thing here, we want to pass in here a border. So in order to match that item there, we can just pass in here the border and pass in here a border stroke. And we want to pass in a width of 1 dp. And we want to check if it's going to be selected, then we can just pass in a certain type of color. So we want to check if this is going to be selected, then we can just pass in here the color. And if not, then we can just pass in here the else. If it's not selected, then we can just use the material theme. And we pass in here primary. So if it's going to be selected, then we are going to use here the primary color, and we are going to tint it to just decrease the opacity by 50%. And if not, then we can just pass in here our material theme, and this we want to pass in here the color to be surface, not primary. And we have to use this variable here, shape.large. Okay, and we want to change the background color of a certain item which is going to be selected. So if it's going to be selected, then we have to change the background color of that particular chip which is going to be selected. So let's pass in here selected. We're going to pass in this to be also the same, and else if not the case here, then we have to pass in another color. So we can just pass in here and also we want to pass in here when we have the content color. And we're going to use the on primary here. Okay, so this is everything about our card here, which we want to change the colors whenever we are going to be changing using this state here. Okay, now let's add here a row, which is going to help us to display all of those items in a particular way. So here we can pass in the horizontal arrangement. And we want to arrange it to center. Okay, we can just pass in here also a modifier and pass in here a modifier. And give it a padding of 8 dp. Okay, so here is our our item chip. As you can see here, we have the two items inside the row. So we have an icon and also we have the title. So now let's just create here our icon. The first case here, we can just write here icon. And basically we can just pass in, for example, we are going to use the painter resource because we are going to be providing this. So that's why we are using here a painter resource, and then we can just pass in the painter resource ID. So we can just call here our icon res. And for now on the content description here, we can just pass in here to be null. So as you can see here, we have our item, and now we can just force this to occupy a particular size. So we want this to have a size of 24 dp. And just call here modifier.size. And give it a 24 dp. Okay, now let's create here a spacer. And we want here a spacer of 8 dp. Now let's add here a text. And basically here inside, we can just pass in our title. And change the style here. And we want to use a header 6. So we can just use here material theme dot typography and use header 6 for our case here. Okay, and use here a font weight of medium. So now our item here is complete, And basically we can just navigate here back inside our Relational. So inside here, basically now we can just pass in our items. Okay, now let's call here our category item, and we have to pass in here the category res ID. So the first case here, we can just call here category dot res ID. So we are going to have here our item and also the title. So we can just call here category dot title. And we want to see if it's going to be selected or not. So for this case, we can just check here our category. If the category is going to be equal to a home state, so let's pass in here our home state dot category. So if this is going to be equal to true, then it's going to be selected. So here basically now we can just inside our on click item, then we can just invoke our category change. So here we can just call here our home view model dot on category change. And basically now we can just pass in here the category, which is going to be the selected category basically. And let's add here a spacer, and basically we can just pass in here a modifier. Okay, so now here we have written a lot of code. Let's just try and test it. We can just navigate here inside our main activity and come inside here and call our home screen for now, and then on navigate here we're going just to implement it later. So for now, let's try to run this inside our application, and then now let's just try to run it first. So here we have our items launched inside our application, and as you can see here we have a slight problem, and we can easily fix it here by changing the colors. So we can just navigate here inside our home, and let's go back here inside our background color. So instead of using here on surface, we have to use the surface color. So here we can just pass in the surface. Okay, now let's try to rerun again and see the changes. So now everything is looking good. As you can see here, we have our items. Whenever we select it, then it's going to change the colors. And as you can see, we have everything working. Okay, now let's continue to add other items inside here, our home screen. Okay, so now here we have our items. Then we have to add the items which is going to display all of those categories. So now let's pass in here the items. Then we're going to use our home state, and we want to obtain these items here. Okay, so inside here now we can create another composable that is going to help us to display here all of these categories. Okay, now let's just come below here and create a new composable, and we can just call this shopping items. Okay, so the first case here we want to pass in the item, and which is going to be of type items with store and list. And we want to check if this is going to be is checked. And we want to have here the on item click, and also we want to invoke the on check change. So we're going to pass in here the items. Okay, so inside here the on checked change, we're going to pass in the selected item and whether or not it is selected. And we're going just to return here a unit and the on item clicked. So whenever the item is going to be clicked, so for example, if we want to navigate and go to update our item, then we're going to use this. And this one is going to be used for the checked box. Okay. Okay, so here is just going to be our items. So we are going to have, for example, here a banana. And this is just going to be included inside a card. So now let's start to create here our card. And inside here, we want to pass in here a modifier. Then we want to fill the max width. And we want to make this to be clickable. And here we can just invoke the on item click. Okay, and let's give it a padding of 8 dp. All right, so inside here we have the items which are just going to be arranged inside the row, and as you can see here, they're just spaced in a between. Okay, now let's create here our row. And first, let's pass in here a modifier. And we want to fill the max width. Okay, also we want to pass in the horizontal arrangement, and we want to make them to space between. Okay, and here we want to pass in the vertical alignment, and we want to center them vertically. Okay. So now here we have our items, so we can create, for example, here our first category here, which is just going to be arranged inside the column. As you can see here, we have the banana farmers, and also we have the date. So now let's create here a column. And we can just pass in here a modifier. And pass in a padding of 8 dp. Okay, so the first case here we have the title text, which is just going to be the title of that particular item. So let's pass in here the text. Okay, so we're going to use our item here, dot item name. So let's change a style here. And we can just use here header 6. And we want to make the font weight. And just transform this to be a bold. Okay, now let's pass in here a spacer. And pass in here a space of 4 dp. Okay, now we want to pass in here for the store. Okay, so we want to pass in here the store name, but I'm not getting here, so I think we forgot here inside our store to pass in the store name. Okay, so we have to create inside here our store data model class, so you can easily navigate here, for example, inside the store, which is just found inside our models. So basically here we can just change and add also here a store name, which is just going to be of type string. Okay, and now let's just navigate here back, and inside here we can just pass in here the store name. Okay, now let's pass in here a spacer of 4 dp. Okay, so we want to pass in here the date. Okay, now let's pass in here the compositional local provider. And we want to decrease the opacity, so we can just use here the local content alpha. And we want to use this provide keyword here and provide the content disabled, for example, here. So we can just use the content alpha. And then inside here, now we can just pass in our text. Okay, so now we want to format our date. So let's create here a simple method, which is just going to help us to format our date. So let's create here a function and call it format date. And this is going to receive a date. And it's going to return us a string. Okay, so for this case, we can just use a simple date format. And inside here, we have to pass in our pattern. So for our case here, we can just use this pattern here. Okay, so this is just the case here. So we are going to use this button here to format the date, which is just going to be in form of a date, which is we are going to be storing inside our database. And for this case, we're going to format this and return this type of particular date here. So basically here we can just call our format date and pass in our item. Okay, now let's change the style. And we can use here the material theme.typography. And we want to use this subtitle 1. Okay, so we have finished to create here our first item. Now we can just focus on the second part. So as you can see here, we have the first part here, which is just going to display the details here. And also we have another detail, which is just going to be beside here. So let's create another column here. And also here we are just going to pass in here the modifier, and we want to pass in the modifier padding also to be 8dp. Okay, so the first case here we want to display the quantity, so we can just pass in the text, and this text here we can just write here, for example, QTY, and we can use the string template here. And pass in here the QTY which we want. Okay, and let's style this a little bit, so we can just pass in here our style. And we're going to use a typography header 6. Okay, and let's make the font weight to be bold. Now let's add a little spacer here of 4dp. Now let's create here a checkbox. And we're going to check if it's going to be is checked. And whenever we perform here any changes, let's put this first in a separate line. And we can just call here on checked change. And we want to invoke it here. Okay, so we have to pass in here 2 items, so we can just pass in here the item.item for the first case here, and then also we have to pass in if it's going to be true or false, whether it's checked or not. So that is just the case. Okay, so now let's just navigate inside here. So inside our home state, we can just easily call here now our shopping item. Okay, so we're going to pass in here it, and also if it's going to be checked, so you can just pass in it.item.isChecked. Okay, now let's put this first on a separate line, and whenever the unchecked change is going to be invoked, then we can just easily change here. We can use here our home view model and call here on item checked change. Then we have everything here. And basically here, this is just going to invoke the on navigate. So whenever we click, for example, this shopping list item, we can just call here on the on navigate, and we can invoke it here. Okay, now we can just use it.item.id and basically pass it so that we can easily use it inside our detail screen. Okay, so this is just how you can easily create our home screen. Now let's try to run again and see if everything is working perfectly. Now when we run our application, we're just getting this error here. So as you can see, Room cannot verify the data integrity. So as we have changed our entities, thus Room is going to throw this exception here, or unless we have to provide those database migrations. So for now, we are not going to implement these migrations. So for a case, we can just easily navigate back inside our application and also delete the caches so that we can easily start it. Or if you uninstall and install again your application, then it's going to be running smoothly. Okay, so when you navigate inside here, your phone, you can just easily delete this, or you can just uninstall it. And now let's just reinstall again our application here. Okay, so now everything is working perfectly. So we have no any problem. So we don't see anything here because we have an empty state. So now let's just focus here on adding this item and navigating, for example, to the detail screen so that we can just easily create the details. Okay, so now let's just close everything here. And we're going to navigate inside here our UI and details and create a new coding class or file. And for case here, we're just going to create our detail view model. Okay, so this is just going to inherit from a view model. Okay, now let's pass in here our constructor for the case. So we want to provide here a private val. So we are going to receive here, for example, the item ID. So whenever we navigate, for example, when we click a particular item and navigate to the detail screen, we want to receive the item ID. So for this case here, we can just pass in here the item ID, which is just going to be of type int. And another thing here which we want to receive is the repository. So we can just create our repository. And we can just use here a graph and create our repository. Okay, so the first case here, we want to create our data class, which is going to hold us our state. So we can just call this detail state. Okay, so the first case which we want to store here is just the store list. So for the first time, which is just going to be an empty list. The item which we are going to save is going to be of type string. And for the first time, it's just going to be an empty. And also the store. So we can just initialize here an empty date. Okay, and also the quantity. Okay, another thing here is screen dialog. Also, we are going to have here is updating item. So whenever we want to update an item, then we are going to change this to be true so that we can easily access the update methods and functionalities. And also here we can just get the category. And basically we can just create here an empty category. Okay, so here we have our state. Now we can just easily initialize it inside here. Okay, now let's remit this to be a private set so we don't have to reinitialize this outside of our detail view model. Okay, so we want to be able to tell if the user is not typing anything so that we can disable this button here. So we have to have a certain type of a state that is going to help us to understand this. So for example, here we can just easily create a variable which is just called is filled not empty. So for example, here we can just call this val. And this is just going to be of type boolean. Okay, now we can just write here our get function, and basically we can just check in the state which we are going to have. So we want to check if the items, and we can just use is not empty. And also we can just check in the store. So for example, here state.store. And also we can just check the quantity if it's not going to be empty. So basically we can just use this inside our UI in order to restrict a user whenever these items are going to be empty. And we're just using here get function so that we can easily change whenever the state is going to change here. So this is just going to call again. So not to just to initialize this to false throughout our application. So whenever I call this method here, it's going to check first this condition here and then return our function. Okay, so now also we want to pass in the methods which are going to modify the state. So for example, here the on item change. So let's create here on item change. And we can change the item equals to new value. Okay, now let's create everything for all. So let's press Ctrl C here and Ctrl V. Okay, now here we want to change the store. And instead of item here, we can just change the store. Okay, now the on quantity change here. And here we can just pass in a date. Okay, so here we have our methods which are going to modify our state. Okay, now also we want to be able to add and remove items, for example. So we want to be able to add the items. Now let's create here a function. Now let's just call this a private. Want to be able to add the list items which we have. So we can just use here our view model scope.launch. And inside here we can just use our utils. And we're going to add everything here. So for example, here we want to insert, so we can just use our repository. And we want to insert a list. Now let's create here our shopping list. Okay, so that was adding list items. So we have the list items inside our utils. So whenever you navigate here inside our utils, you can just see we have these categories which we are just going to be inserting them, for example, inside our database. Okay, so now we want to be adding, for example, the shopping item, the items which we are going to be creating. So we can just easily add here another function. So let's create here function.add shopping list item. And we can use our repository.insert item. Okay, so inside here we can just create a new item, and we can just use the item name, for example, here. Okay, so the list ID, which is just going to be the category which we are going to be selecting. So we can just use here the category .id, and also the date here is just going to be state.date. Okay, now the quantity, which is just going to be the state.quantity. So here we can just use the state.storelist. Okay, now we can just find here the store name. and we want to get the ID, and if not, then we can just return here 0. Okay, so basically here we are just filtering. We want to get the store list ID, so we can just find the store name, and we want basically to be returned with the store list ID so that we can just easily store it inside here. Okay, now here we want to check if it's checked. And for the first case, because we are just going to be adding a brand new item, we're just going to make this to be false. So whenever we want to update this to be checked or not, then we are going to use the update items. Okay, so here we have our adding of our shopping items. Okay, now let's create here a function that is going to help us to update the shopping list item. Okay, now we have to pass in here the ID of which is just going to be the selected item so that we can easily update it. So we can just use here our view model scope.launch, and basically here now we can just use our repository, and we can just, for example, use the update, or we can just use the insert item again, repository.insert item, and we have to pass in here our item. We can just pass in here the item name. So we can just going to use again the state dot. We can just copy this, everything here. And basically we can just pass in here the ID. So whenever we use here our ID, then it is going to find this same exit item, and then it's just going to override the items with these particulars here. Okay, so here we have updated our item. Now another thing which we want to do here is to be able to add a store. So let's create here a function and call this add store. And basically we can just call here view model scope.launch, and we can just call here our repository, not insert store. Now let's create here our store. So we can just pass in here our store name. We can use state.store. And we can just use here again our state.category.id as our list ID foreign key here in order to save it. Okay, now let's write here another function which is just going to help us to get the stores. So get store, for example. Okay, now let's use here our view model scope.launch, and basically we can just call here our repository .stores, and we want to collect latest, and we can just modify here our state, and we want to use state.copy, and let's save here our store list, which is just going to be equal to it. So here we are just going to fetch all of the stores which we are going to be saving them. Okay, so that was just the methods which are going to help us to get our data. Okay, now let's write here some other logics which are going to help us to, for example, whenever we initialize here our view model so that we can easily call them. Okay, so the first case here we want to init the variable. Okay, now let's call here our add list items. Another thing which we want to do is to get the stores, which we are going to see them whenever we use them. Now again, we want to update the state. So whenever the item ID is not going to be equal to -1, so we want to fetch that particular item and update our state so that we can easily update our item. So for this case, we can just call here item ID. If it's not going to be equal to -1, then we know we are just updating the item. So for this case, we can just call here our view model scope.launch. And inside here, we can just call our repository.getItem with its store and list. And basically we want to pass in here the item ID so that we can just get this particular item, and we want to call collect latest. Okay, so as you can see here, we're just calling this get item with filtered with list ID so that we can just pass in the item ID which we have here. And again, now we want to use this collect latest in order to filter it. Okay, now inside here we can just call here our state, and we can just call state.copy, and we can just use it.item. Okay, so we are just going to use here the get item with the store list so that we can just get a single item and not a list of items that are going to be filtered with this particular ID. So for our case, we want just to get a single item, so we're just going to use this get item with the store and list. And for this case here, now we can just pass in the item.name, store.storename, again the date. So we can just use here it.item.date. So here we're just going to pre-populate all of those items. So the category, so we are just going to use here our utils. And we want to find this particular item. So we're just going to rename this to be C. So let's use C.id. If it's going to be equal to it.shoppinglist.id. And if it's not found, then we can just return here a default category item. Okay, so this method can just not find this particular ID, so we are just going to return the default one. Okay, now also the quantity. We can just change here our quantity and pass in here it.item.qt. Okay, so now here we're just updating our item. Also, again, we can just create here another init function, and we can just tell the state. Okay, now we can just call here state.copy and pass in is updating equals to true. Okay, now we have to pass in this state to be up here. Okay, so we are just checking here if the state is not here, so we can just change this state to be is updating, and otherwise not, then we are just going to pass in is updating not, so that we can just focus here on updating. Okay, so another thing, whenever we are just passing here these variables here by not passing, because we are just passing here at runtime this item ID here, so we have to create a factory method that is going to help us to construct this view model at runtime and pass with these particular dependencies. So this dependency here is just already provided, but this item ID here is not going to be provided at runtime. So for this case, we have to create here, so we can just navigate below here and create a detailed view model factory that is going to help us to construct this view model. So now let's create here a class, and we can just call this, for example, detail view model factory. Okay, so we are going to receive here the ID, and this is going to inherit from the view model provider. Okay, so we have here a method which we have to override, so we can just press Ctrl O. And we have this method here, which is just the onCreate here, which is going to help us to return a particular view model whenever we create or we call this view model factory here. So we are just going to return here our detail view model. And for case here, we want to pass in now the item ID to be this ID, which we are just going to be creating. And we want to call this as T so that we can just fix this. And also we can just suppress this and custom check here. Okay, so whenever we create here our view model, we are just not going to call this detail view model. However, we're just going to use this detail view model factory so that we can easily pass this at runtime. And this is just going to help us to fix all of these problems here. Okay, so now here our view model is ready. As you can see here, we have completed everything. Now the first thing here we want to create is our detail screen. So for this case, let's create a new coding class or file, and we are just going to select this to be a file, and we are just going to call this detail. Okay, so the detail screen here, we are just going to receive an ID, which is just going to be of type int. So whenever, for example, we navigate here and we want to update an item, then we're just going to pass in the ID. That's why we are passing here. And if not, we're just going to pass in -1. So for this case here, we can just call, for example, this navigate app. Okay, so the first case here we want to obtain is just our view model. We can just call here our view model. Okay, now we want to pass in here a factory and not as previously. So we're just going to pass in here our detail view model factory. At runtime, we're just passing here the ID whenever we want to construct this. And here now we have to provide the type, and this is just going to be detail view model. Okay, now let's create here our scaffold, which is just going to help us to hold everything which we have. Okay, now let's create here a new composable, and we can just call this detail entry. Okay, now I want to make also this to be private. Okay, so the first case in here, we want to pass in the modifier. So we have a default modifier. Okay, another thing here is just the on-store change. Okay, another thing which we're just going to add here is just the on-item change. And the on-category change here. And here we want to pass in the category. And here is just the on-dialog dismissed. Okay, another thing here is just the on-save store. So for example, we want to save the store. Okay, another callback here is just to update the items. So for example, here we want to update items. And lastly, but not least, here is just to navigate up whenever we finish up and call this navigate up. Okay, so inside this column here, we have to pass in, for example, a padding of 16 dp. So you can just pass in here a modifier. Okay, we want to have another state that is going to help us to enable this particular type. Whenever we click here, for example, we can easily just insert this data here. So we can just create here our state. And we can just call here by remember. Okay, so the first case here which we want to do is to create the text fields, which are going to help us to insert these particular items. Okay, now let's create here the text field. Okay, let's pass in here a label. Okay, now we want to change the colors here, so we can just call here our text field default. Okay, so the next thing here, we have created first this particular item here. Now we want to create this, and this is just we have a button here, and also we have a text field. So for this case here, we can just create here a row. Okay, now we want to check here if this particular item is going to be enabled. So if it's enabled, okay, so we are just checking here with this particular state here if it's going to be enabled, and if not, then we are just going to pass nothing here, and nothing is going to be typed inside here. You can just pass in here a modifier. Okay, so similarly the colors, we are just going to copy this. And our label is going to be of type store. Okay, now let's pass in here the leading icon. And we can just call this keyboard arrow down. And we can just make this to be clickable. And we want to invoke this, so we want to call the state dot is screen dialog dismissed here. Okay, so we are just invoking here, and we're going to be negating the state of the is screen dialog dismissed here. So if it's true, then it's going to be false, and if it's false, then it's going to be true. So this is how we are just going to use this particular item here. Okay, so basically we want, whenever we click this, then we are going to show this particular pop-up, which is going to help us whenever we select here, then the item is going to be added inside here. So how can we do this? Now we can just easily create here a pop-up. Now we can just navigate below this and create here a pop-up. And we can just call here on dismiss. And we can just negate here is the screen dialog dismissed. Okay, now the next case here, we can just create here our surface. And for each particular list item here, we want to create a text. And the first case, we want to provide a padding of 8 dp. And the second thing, we want to make this to be clickable. Okay, so whenever we click this item here, we can just call here our on store item change. On store change, and we can just call dot invoke here. And we want to pass it dot store name. And the case here, we want to call here on dialog dismiss. And we can just call here our state. So we're just going to negate our state here. Okay, so this is just going to be our pop-up, which we are just going to be creating. Okay, now the next thing here is just create a text button, which is just going to help us to be creating a new item here. So as you can see, we have this button here. Okay. Okay, now we can just call here our text. And if this text is going to be is enabled, we can use that state there. If is enabled, then we can just call save. And else, we can just call here new. Okay, and here we can just call here our on save store. and invoke. And if this is just the case, then we want to update our state here, and we can just call our negation here is new enabled. And else again, we can just call here is new enabled, and we can just call it, we can negate this is new enabled for our case here. Okay, now the next case here which we want to create here is just this particular next row here. So as you can see here, we have a row, and inside this row we have another row that contains this date range here and also the quantity text field here. And now let's pass in here our horizontal arrangement. Okay, now inside here, let's create another row to create that first particular item, which is just this date range here. And we want to center it vertically. Okay, now let's create here our first icon. And we want to use this, we want to use the date range. And we can just make this to be null here. Okay, now let's pass in here a spacer for DP. And we can just use here the text, the date formatter. The date, and basically we can just transform that inside here. Okay, now again, let's create here a spacer for DP. Okay, so another thing here is we want to create a DatePicker dialog. And in Jetpack Compose, until now, we don't have a composable that is going to help us to make this DatePicker dialog. So we can easily create it by ourselves by using the XML way. So for this case, let's create here a new composable. And this composable, we are just going to call this DatePicker dialog. Okay, now inside here, we are just going to pass in the context which we want. Okay, so the first case here, we are just going to initialize the calendar. And we can just call here calendar.getInstance. Okay, now we want to get the current month and the days, so we can just create here variables. So we can call here year, for example, and we can just call calendar.get. And we want to get day of month. It's going to return us a particular date. Now again, here we can just call here our calendar.time, and we can initialize this to this particular date, which we are just going to create it here. Okay, now another thing here, we are just going to create a state. And we can just call this remember, and then it's just going to be a mutable state of an empty string for now. Okay, now let's just declare here our DatePicker dialog, and now we can just call here our DatePicker dialog and create by initializing here and pass in here the initial values. So the first case here, we can just pass in the context. Okay, so here we are not going to use this DatePicker here. And also we are just passing here the, for example, a year. Which is just going to be of type int also. Okay, so now here we can just pass in our calendar. Okay, so now here we have our calendar. Now we can just call calendar.set. and day of month, which are just the variables which you're going to receive inside this callback here. Then after that, we can just call here our onDateSelected, and we can just invoke it here. Now we can just call here our calendar.time so that we can just return the time which we have selected here. And DatePicker dialog. So we have created here our composable, which is just going to create us a DatePicker dialog, which is going to help us to pick up the date. So as you can see here, we have the variables which we are going to create our date and month, and also we have here our selected date. Okay, so we are just going not to use this. We can easily delete it. Okay, so for now here we have the DatePicker dialog. So as you can see, we are just using here this callback here to get the date, and basically we can use this calendar here, and basically here we have to use the calendar. So now here we have our DatePicker dialog. Now let's just navigate inside here our and basically now we can just call here our DatePicker composable here, and then we have to pass in the context, and basically we can just call here our local context. Okay, now when we call here the onDateSelected, so we are going to receive here a date. Okay, so now we want to be able to invoke this, and basically to invoke this we have to create here an icon or a button that is going to help us to invoke this. So let's create here an icon button, for example. And here we pass in null. Okay, so inside here, inside the onClick, we can just call here the DatePicker dialog, and basically now we can just call .show. Okay, so the next thing here is we have to create this text field where we're going to add in the quantity. So below this row here, we can just collapse this, and now we have to create our text field. Okay, and here we can just call state.qty, and inside here the onValue change, we can just call the onQuantity change. And basically let's make it to be keyboard number. Okay, now let's pass in here a modifier. Okay, and on the part of colors here, we can just use this similar here. So let's just press Ctrl+C. Okay, so now I think we have completed to create here our items. So we have everything here. Now the next thing here is to create these scrollable items here where we can easily pick up these items here. Okay, so now what we can do here, let's just collapse this. Okay, now below this row here, we can just easily create a spacer. Okay, now let's pass in here our items, and basically we are just going to use here utils.category. Okay, now let's call here our category, which is just the category items, and we created inside our home composables. Okay, now we can just pass in here our category icon res. We can just call here our category. And now here we can just check the category. If the category is going to be equal to state, dot category, then we know this is just going to be selected. Okay, and inside here we can just call the on category change. Let's pass in a spacer of 14 dp. Okay, so now we have finished to create this. Now let's just create this item here, this button here, which is going to add the item or update the particular item. So for this case here, now let's just navigate below this here. Now the first case here, we can just create the button title is updating item. Then we can just call here update item. Now let's first pass in here a modifier. Okay, so whenever we click here, we want to be checking between two possible scenarios. So if we are updating, then we want to update the item, and if not, then we want to be saving an item. So for this case, we can just use a while statement inside the on click here. So we can just check the state. And now after that, whenever we click this button, we want to navigate back to our screen. So we can just call here navigate app.invoke. Okay, now we want to check this enabled status. Now we can just check the state if this is going to be particularly the state. Okay, so we want to disable this button if these are going to be not empty. And if they are empty, then we have to disable this button here. Okay, now let's create here a preview composable. So we can just write here prev. Okay, now let's call here our detail entry. Okay, now let's preview here our changes and see the changes which we have created. Okay, so here is just our output. Now let's just come here inside our preview and show system UI, and we want to see everything, and we can just make it to be true here. Okay, so as you can see here, everything is looking good, except here we have two overlapping items here. We can just navigate, and this is just going to be inside this button here. Okay, so it's going to be between these two rows here. So we didn't add here a spacer. So we can just copy this spacer here, press Ctrl C, press Ctrl V here. Okay, now everything is looking perfectly. So here we can just easily scroll this whenever we just start an interactive mode. Okay, so now let's hook up everything and make everything just functional. Okay, so now here we have finished to create everything. Now we can just navigate here inside and call our detail entry inside our detail screen. Now the on date selected, we can just call here our view model. Okay, now inside here, for example, on save a store, we want to save the store. So we can just call here our view model. And when we want to save the items, we can just call here our view model. Okay, so now here we have our detail screen. However, now we are just calling here our home screen directly inside here our main activity. So we have to create here our navigation logic so that we can easily navigate between these two screens smoothly. So how can we do this? Now let's just create here a new content class or file. We can just create here a new content class, and we're just going to call this navigation. Okay, now we want to create here the routes which we are going to be moving to and from. So let's create here an enum class. Okay, so inside here the parameter, we can just pass in here the nav host controller. So make sure you have added the dependency for navigation so that you can have this nav host controller here. Okay, now let's create here the navigation host. And the first case here, we have to pass in the nav controller, and then we can just pass in here the nav host controller. Okay, so another thing here, we have to pass in the start destination. So the destination which we want to start. So for case here, we are just going to use routes.home.name. This is just going to be the first when our application is going to be launched. So we are going to navigate directly to the home screen first. Okay, so for that case, let's create here a composable, and let's define here the route. And this route, we are going to use here routes.home.name. So basically this is just we're going to define here the composable that is going to be the home screen. So let's pass in here the home screen. And basically here we have the on navigate. So whenever we want to navigate, now we can easily just navigate again. Okay, so we are going to have here a parameter here which is going to be an ID. So we can just rename it to be an ID. So whenever we want to navigate, for example, here to another route, so we can just call here our nav host controller, and we want to call .navigate. And basically we are going to navigate to a certain route. So for case here, let's define this route here. And for case, we are going to define here a route that has a parameter which we have to pass it. So for example, the ID, whenever we click an item and navigate to the detail screen, that we want to pass in the ID. So for this case, this is how we can easily pass in the routes. So you have to type as how I type here. Otherwise, you're just going to get an errors. Okay. And here we want to pass in the ID, which is just going to be equal to the ID which we have passed here. Okay. Now for this case here, we have created our first composable. Now let's create the next composable, which is just going to be the composable of our detail screen. Now let's write here our route. Okay, now this here we have to also create by using the routes which we have defined there. So we can just call here routes.detail. Okay, we have to pass in here the question mark to be this, and we are just going to pass in here the ID which we have to replace it. So as you can see here, we are just using an optional argument here to be the ID which we have to pass in here. So sometimes we are not going to be creating, or we are not going to be updating an item. We are going to be creating a new item. So for this case, we don't have an ID here to pass. And for this case, we have created this. Okay. Now we want to be able to obtain the arguments. So we can just write here the arguments, and basically let's write here a list of, and this list of the nav arguments which we are going to receive for our case. And for case here, we are going to receive an ID, an argument which is just going to be an ID, and its type is going to be of type int. So let's write here type. and call it nav type int. So this is just going to be an int type. Okay. Now let's get the ID from these arguments. So for this case, we can just call here ID. So we are going to receive here the backstack entry. So we can just call it here dot arguments. And this can be nullable. So we want to get int. And basically this is just going to be an ID. And if there is nothing here, because we know that we don't have anything, we are creating a new item. We want to return -1 so that we can just tell, hey, we are just creating a new item and not updating an item. Okay, now we can just call here our detail screen and basically pass in here the ID. Okay, so the ID here is just going to be this ID. And whenever we want to navigate back, so we can just call here our nav host controller and call navigate up. And this one is going to return us to the uppermost composable inside our backstack entry. And for this case here, we have our navigation logic here, which is just really simple because we have only 2 composables. Okay, so the next thing here which we have to do is we have to navigate inside our main activity here, and we have to change the logic here and call the navigation host here. Okay, so inside here our class, we can just create a new composable. Now let's create here a composable, and we're just going to call this jet shopping app, for example. Okay, so one thing here, we can just create here directory. So we want to provide here a default. We can just call here remember nav controller. And we don't have to be passing here. So whenever we want to, we can just navigate here inside our main activity and remove this directly here. Okay, so now inside here our set content view, now we can just call here our jet shopping. Okay, so I think everything is going to be looking good. Now let's try to relaunch our application inside our phone and see the changes we have made. So our application is launched again. Okay, so inside here, let's create a new item. So for example, let's call this banana. And when we click here, we have our market. And also let's select a date here. So we are going to be doing this shopping tomorrow. And this is just going to be fruits. Now let's click add items here. And we are navigating back to our home screen here. And as you can see, we can just easily select this. Fruits, we can easily now, as you can see, we had added this banana in the category of fruits here. Okay, so here we have our items, and as you can see, whenever we select here, we can just change this category and filter them. So when we select fruits, we have here, for example, bananas and watermelon. And whenever we select, for example, here electronics, we have just this single item here. And whenever we click this none here, we have all of our items. So this is how you create a simple shopping list application using Jetpack Compose and Room database inside Android Studio. Okay, so one operation which is missing inside our application is now when we want to delete an item. So we cannot delete an item. So we want to create a swap to dismiss, which is going to help us to dismiss an item whenever we want to delete a particular item. So how can we do this? Now let's navigate back inside here our home category. And inside here, we have our shopping list items. So what we want to do here is to create a dismiss state. So let's create here var and call this dismiss state. the first thing here, we want to pass in the confirm state change. So whenever our state changes, what do we want to do? So we are going to have here a value equals to be dismissed to an end. Then we want to call our home view model. Okay. Now let's create here our swipe to dismiss composable. So you can just create anything. So for my case, I'm just going to create here a surface. Another thing which we want to pass in here is just the dismiss content here. And we are going to pass in here the shopping items. So let's just press here Ctrl X and pass in here the dismissed content, which is just going to be these items here. Okay, now let's try to rerun again here our application and see the changes. Everything is good. Let's try to dismiss here our watermelon and see. And now, as you can see, our items are just deleted. Guys, so this is how you create a simple shopping list application that is going to help you to understand Jetpack Compose and Room database and how to mix them together. So if you find this video helpful, and don't forget to provide a like and subscribe for more videos. So bye bye for now. See you in the next video.